So, victims of abuse often do not realize they're in an abuse dynamic for quite a bit until things start to come together. And so, I think there are three general reasons, broadly speaking, that victims of abuse don't recognize they're in an abuse dynamic. The first one is going to be very, very familiar to every victim of abuse, and that's going to be because you've been gaslit by the abuser. The abuser is telling you that you are doing things that are wrong, or that the things that they are doing are because of you. So they basically flip cause and effect in the relationship, and it ends up being very confusing for the victim to kind of parse out like what's happening. So the thing is, we have a model of the world and of other people and of relationship dynamics. Basically, we have a way that we think that these things work. And so when we're in a relationship with someone who's using words like love, and we have an existing pattern of what that we believe that is, we'll put that pattern on the relationship. So we think, oh, this person is saying they love me. They're my parents. They're my best friend. They're my partner, right? And so these words have power, they have meaning, and we use the power and the meaning to apply it to the relationship dynamic so that we think it's a genuine partnership or that it is actually family, regardless of how things are actually occurring within the relationship dynamic. Same thing with the best friends, right? So often people will call a person their best friend and it's the person they've known the longest. And so they spend a lot of time around each other from a young age, but the quality of that friend is not best. And it's hard to see when the other person or you or both are using that best friend language because there's a paradigm, there's a framework, there's a way of thinking that goes along with these words. So the abuser is flipping cause and effect. They're gaslighting the victim. They are basically sabotaging the victim's understanding of reality and also doing it under the cover of this false framework that everybody thinks is the one that's operating. Okay. So the other thing too is when you're using the wrong framework, when things occur, you file it away differently or you understand it differently. So you'll see people who don't realize they're in an abuse dynamic refer to the relationship before they realize it. They'll refer to the relationship as having a lot of ups and downs. We've been through a lot, but at the end of the day, we still love each other. So- they don't see the coercion, they don't see the attempts to control, they don't see that as being anything other than general relationship conflict, possibly passion. I think they're in a passionate relationship. And so the victim is having these circular arguments with the abuser, and they don't realize the reason they're having these circular arguments with the abuser and the reason why it never resolves whatever the issue is because the abuser doesn't actually care about reality. They care about coercing the victim into doing what they want, into believing what they think they should believe or feel or think. So you're arguing about reality, but you don't recognize that that's what you're doing. And the abuser is doing abuser things to coerce the victim, to abuse the victim, to push the victim into misthinking about reality, to accept the abuser's construct of reality and of the relationship. It's on outofthefog.net. There's like a website, and they've identified that, if you're a victim of, well, the website's more about personality disorders, but that when you're dealing with, like, let's say a high conflict person, an abuser, potentially someone who is got a personality disorder, that you are going to be in the fog, fear, obligation, and guilt. Those are often the levers that they're using to manipulate the victim. So the victim, they think they know what reality is about the abuser, and they don't. The abuser is using that false reality to provide cover and maneuver and manipulate, because those are the premises that the victim has accepted, right? When you love someone, you XYZ. And then the gaslighting and the manipulation is creating this fog that makes it extremely difficult to see what the reality is. The other thing is that we're asking victims to have drawn two conclusions that are extremely difficult to do. One is to recognize the behaviors as abuse. And then, second, to recognize the abuse makes this person an abuser. Those are two levels of conclusions that you have to draw to get somebody or to get yourself to a place where you go, oh no, I've been a victim of abuse and I'm experiencing like abuse from this person. So I talked about this in the ACEs video, which is that whenever the ACEs are adverse childhood experiences, whenever the researchers are or health professionals are asking patients or subjects about their adverse childhood experiences, they don't ask them, "Oh, did you experience emotional neglect? Did you experience stress? Did you experience abuse?" No. What they ask is, did anyone love you? Did you feel like you were alone when you were a kid or that anyone cared about you? Did anyone berate, humiliate, or scream at you like aggressively? Did anyone put their hands on you and hit and punch and harm you? The reason they ask the questions that way is that if you ask, did anyone abuse you? You're asking someone to draw a conclusion from their experiences. Well, most people will not correctly draw that experience because they're operating under a different mindset of whatever the heck was happening there. So they ask the question, "Hey, did someone hit you? Did you experience childhood sexual assault? Um, Physical contact, sexual contact." They're going to ask for the specific behaviors because that they're looking for the conclusion, but they know that people don't necessarily draw the conclusion from the behaviors. All right. So let's say you're a victim of abuse and you figured out, oh, wait a minute. You've drawn the conclusion, oh, this is abuse. These behaviors are abusive. Many victims of abuse don't feel comfortable taking that next step and going, oh, this person's an abuser, because they love that person. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in this dynamic with them. And so, because they love that person, they're going to think it's some kind of a mistake often. They just don't know. All I need to do is explain to them that what they're doing is not okay and that it is abuse, and then they'll stop doing it. Now, I've had success once in my entire life with explaining to an abuser that what they were doing was abusive. And what happened was they did stop doing that specific behavior. And then they went on to other behaviors. I was literally like, wait, what? Because what I didn't understand at that point was that the reason they were abusing was because they had a way of thinking, unreasonable entitlement, and that they were operating from this way of thinking, and that was directing what they were doing. So it wasn't the behaviors in and of themselves that were driving the abuse. It was the way they were thinking that drove the behaviors that then was driving the abuse. And so if I identified specific abuse behaviors, this person stopped doing those behaviors, but went to different ones. And in fact, I mistakenly made them a better abuser. So they stopped doing the overtly abusive behaviors and shifted to the things that are very, very difficult to tell that are abuse. So more psychological, more coercive, harder to clock. And, by the time you realize that often your life is like a jail around you and you didn't realize it was happening while it was happening. So my apologies to all of his future victims. I didn't realize. So victims of abuse are having to make two different conclusions, like separate conclusions. One, that the behavior is not just ups and downs, it's abuse. And then that because this person is engaging in a pattern of abuse, that is now then that they are the abuser. And also, what makes this a problem for many victims of abuse is that the longer you are in a relationship with an unhealthy, dysfunctional, abusive person, in order to preserve yourself, your safety, you then start doing things that are on the spectrum of abuse just to protect yourself because you would otherwise be destroyed. So victims either end up often being completely destroyed or turning into a person that they don't recognize and would never choose to be. In the military, it's called moral injury. When you're doing something that goes against your own moral code, but you're doing it because, let's say, you're supposed to, or in this specific case, because you're trying to protect yourself. And the abuser doesn't respect boundaries. So the only way to protect yourself are behaviors on the spectrum of abuse. So victims then get confused about who is the abuser, who is the victim. And so not only are these two conclusions that we're trying to draw, but then this secondary conclusion is like, oh, wait a minute. Am I doing behaviors on the spectrum of abuse? Well, if I stop doing these things, this person is continuing to power over me at my expense for their benefit, and they're harming me. So the result of this for many victims of abuse is a lot of confusion, a lot of shame. And this is why it's so important to sit down, in my opinion, with a mental health professional so that you can start to like pull the threads of like what was happening and recontextualize the incidents and have an overarching eye like on the pattern of behaviors and the relationships. It's extremely difficult to do it from the inside on your own. And on just a side note, I don't watch TV really anymore. And I do see some movies, but I don't really engage with media like I used to. A lot of it is because the stories that are being told are abuse stories, toxic relationships that are being presented in a certain way as if it is romantic or as if it is comedy. And so I realized I had mislearned so much from popular media about what love was or what relationships are or what family is. One of the older shows that I remember detesting, by the way, was the show called Everybody Loves Raymond. And I hated this fucking show with a passion. And I didn't understand why everyone else liked the show. Everyone else was like, oh, this is so funny. Well, looking at it back at it with the eyes of 2026, we know that Raymond was the golden child. The mother was extremely abusive. There's sibling abuse happening. There's scapegoat dynamic, and there's anyway. I think I felt that way about the show because the grandmother reminded me of my own grandmother on my mother's side. And so I had this very visceral response to the show, but everyone else seemed to think it was like hilarious. And so things were happening to Marie, like the main wife character, that were so wrong. And then people were like, it's just funny. And oh, that's just it. Everybody loves Raymond. And like that was the conceit of the show. Everybody loves Raymond. You may as well have just called it the golden child, golden family member. So when these things, when you're like, let's say you're in the matrix, you're in the simulation of what you think your life is, and you're watching TV and it's reflecting this stuff back to you, think, oh, well, I guess this is normal, right? Because the media we consume really does a lot happen to set our normal meter. So when the media we're watching is wildly dysfunctional and is showing abuse dynamics without like really calling it out for what it is, often because it's funny or because it's romantic. There's many videos on The Notebook for that very reason. um it can be very subtle. Like I I was seeing clips of The Big Bang Theory like on my YouTube shorts, and I started watching them and I was like, oh, this is like the Penny character, who's a character I was like, "Oh, I like that Penny character," not, just casually. Um, the amount of time she pushes Leonard to accept abuse from either his mother or Sheldon is uncomfortable. Like, I think we all knew that the Howard character was, like a creep and whatever, but the Penny character, I guess I just assumed was like a neutral kind of healthy, safe character or something like that, aside from like her lack of commitment thing with Leonard. But rewatching those clips and seeing her dismiss his feelings and his experience with his mother, and then actually like build relationships with her, or Sheldon's building relationships with her. And it's presented as funny. And I'm like, this is extremely traumatic for this character. Holy, this woman, he was so unloved as a child. He created a hugging machine. And in the context of the show, it's presented as funny. So I'm not saying the tragedy can't ever be funny. And I'm certainly not a comedian, so I'm not, I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that once I realized that, my conception of like what healthy behavior is being based off things that are not healthy. I got to stop watching this. And so I pulled back from like quite a bit of media. So when you're the victim of abuse and you're watching like normal TV shows or movies, and the abuser is gaslighting you, and you think you're in this loving dynamic, that this is your mom, or this is your partner, or this is your best friend, and so you're acting according to the rules of what that relationship is, even though they are not being in the relationship dynamic in that way. They are extracting from you. They are harming you, and they switch cause and effect. So when they harm you, they tell you it's your fault, and so then you're confused, and they use fear, obligation, and guilt to leverage you and manipulate you. That's why one of the biggest signs you're in an abuse dynamic is that you are so confused and it does not make sense, because it doesn't. It's not in line with reality. But people are saying, what they're doing are not the same thing. So anyway, asking victims, hey, to recognize that this person is an abuser. First, you got to get them, well, not get them, but first they've got to recognize that the behavior, even in the first place, is abusive, and then that this person is an abuser. And um, because abuser is like a big bad word, and people don't want to think of the people they love as being bad, so they don't like saying that or doing that. Um, so that's why, before even abuser or abuse dynamic, I'm going with safe and unsafe. This behavior is unsafe. This person is acting unsafe. They are being an unsafe person. And that, I find, is a level that victims can connect with more readily than the one that is about abuse, because that requires them to draw conclusions that for them are emotionally loaded. Anyway, I hope this makes sense, and I'll talk to you next time.